Why you never volunteer in war. Although war in general isn't a pleasant place to be, there are some jobs that are just plain worse than others. Being the first up a ladder during a medieval siege, for instance, doesn't exactly give you great odds of survival. And absolutely no one really wants to be responsible for running messages along the trenches. You may find yourself in the unlucky position of doing some of these jobs regardless, but there are other jobs that some people have mistakenly volunteered for, and then discovered exactly why that was a terrible, terrible idea. Don't volunteer to test mustard gas. Chemical warfare using weapons like mustard gas first appeared during World War I. A highly unpleasant substance, mustard gas was rarely lethal, but its victims suffered severe chemical burns and blisters, were often temporarily blinded, and experienced serious long-term health effects. Introduced by the Germans in 1917 at the Battle of Ypres, it soon earned the name King of the Battle Gases. Although it didn't cause the same volume of fatalities as other gases used, exposure to it required specialist medical care and caused severe damage to the respiratory system. Overall, the recovery time for its effects was much longer, and it lingered in the environment after being released, meaning large areas were contaminated, something soldiers didn't always realize until their skin began to blister. By the end of World War I, just a year later, mustard gas was still fairly new and its health impacts were not quite understood. It was only then that the long-term effects such as respiratory issues and eye lesions started to emerge. Quietly, each country began to examine the effects and impact of mustard gas. One way of doing this was by recruiting quote-unquote volunteer soldiers for experimentation and testing of mustard gas, as the Americans did in the 1940s. Despite this seeming like a test no one would willingly volunteer for, there were approximately 60,000 participants in the study. Many veterans have since spoken out about not being told what they were volunteering for or having been lied to. Conducted by the Chemical Warfare Service, they used a variety of different tests to measure the effects of mustard gas on the volunteers. As well as patch or drop tests, chamber tests, and field tests were used to examine the efficacy of newly developed protective clothing. These research projects predominantly focused on whether racial disparity had anything to do with the impact of mustard gas. As a result, these so-called volunteers were often minority soldiers, and as such they became the victims of these experiments, with many reporting effects such as cancer, eye injury, and PTSD in later life. One such veteran, Rollins Edwards, reported it felt like his skin was on fire. Men fainted around him and all were in bad shape. To make the matter even worse and volunteering seem even more fruitless, there was a distinct lack of follow-up of these studies. No one properly measured the long-term effects and impact of being exposed to mustard gas during these trials, despite evidence mounting over the decades. In the 1990s, the VA began efforts to reach veterans and offer them long overdue benefits for volunteering and their subsequent lifelong sacrifices. Don't volunteer for latrine duty. Even in the comfort of your own home, no one particularly enjoys cleaning a toilet. In war, this is amplified tenfold as the task becomes an extremely unpleasant one. Anecdotes of soldiers unwittingly volunteering for latrine duty during boot camp circulate the internet, with many lamenting falling for the "any volunteers" cry they received from their drill sergeants. Latrines during the war, as one can imagine, were even worse. There were no modern plumbing facilities on the front lines of battle after all. Instead, if one was lucky, were long pits dug some way away from the trenches where soldiers could relieve themselves. The less lucky, such as those at Passchendaele, merely had to use empty bully beef tins, throwing away their contents after use. Latrine trenches were looked after by personnel who were expected to keep them in good condition, or as good condition as a hole in the ground could be kept in. Don't volunteer for night watch. Unless you're a night owl, volunteering for night watch during war can be a dangerous business. As well as dealing with the potential attacks and need to stay alert and survey the area, tired soldiers also had to contend with one other big problem: falling asleep on the job. In some cases, the consequences of a soldier neglecting his duty like this could be disastrous. Someone could easily die, positions could be exposed, and the enemy could sneak past defenses. That's why in 1806 the U.S. Congress made falling asleep on duty in wartime a capital offense, executing those who dozed at their post. In 1861, one such near victim was a soldier who was on guard near Camp Lyon, Washington, D.C. The case of William Scott, now nicknamed the Sleeping Sentinel, caught the nation's attention and the president's. Reportedly, Scott had volunteered for a second consecutive night of duty to relieve a fellow soldier who had fallen ill. After being found asleep at his post, he was immediately arrested and sentenced to death. Luckily, he received a pardon, going on to die some months later while saving fellow soldiers during the Battle of Lee's Mill in Virginia. Even today, falling asleep at your post remains an offense in many of the world's militaries. Don't volunteer to be a Canary girl. During the World Wars, the vast majority of the country's fit and able-bodied young men were quickly conscripted or volunteered to fight on the front lines, but they were not the only gender volunteering their lives to help the war effort. Despite not taking as large of an active part in the fighting, the women of countries like the UK still wanted to do their bit, and the men leaving for war had left the perfect opportunity open for them to do so. Naturally, with half the population all fighting, many workplaces suddenly found themselves with a distinct lack of employees, particularly as at that time the vast majority of their workforce was male. As munitions factories sprung up in abundance, it was women who stepped into the places left behind by the men. One such job women volunteered for was at the Royal Ordnance filling factories, where they worked packing shells with TNT, the result of which were some curious side effects, including causing the women's skin and hair to turn a bright yellow, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. This wasn't just a cosmetic effect either. Reportedly, babies born to Canary girls during the war were also born yellow, although the color thankfully faded away. Turning bright yellow wasn't an ideal situation for anyone, but Canary girls had other more sinister health effects to worry about. Many suffered long-term, developing throat problems, bone issues, and in the worst cases, liver disease from the TNT chemicals. Although they were given milk to drink to combat the chemicals, the women still suffered from anemia and immune system damage that led to over 400 women dying from TNT exposure during World War I. Don't volunteer as a medic at Passchendaele. The Battle of Passchendaele was a particularly awful campaign that resulted in some of the heaviest casualties of World War I. Poor conditions and tactics resulted in a 5-mile advance at the cost of 250,000 soldiers' lives. And in the midst of it all were volunteer medics exposed to the harsh conditions of war. In the UK military, for example, Army nurses worked alongside VADs, Voluntary Aid Detachment nurses, who worked at casualty clearing stations during the battle. These were only 6 to 8 miles from the front lines, and as a result, nurses faced the trauma of seeing the damage of war firsthand, suffered disease from infected wounds, and experienced the dangers of being so close to battle, with some dying in blasts targeting these stations. The Red Cross estimated across World War I, 128 nursing members, 11 general service members, and 6 Joint War Committee members were killed in the war, with at least 100 other VADs also suffering the same fate.